A city is defined by many things. Its culture, its landmarks, its demographics, and perhaps most of all, its history. And of course, like all history, it's not just the good parts that we study and remember. In fact, the darker parts of history often reveal as much, if not more, about our societies and ourselves as the things that we choose to celebrate. This is especially true of famous crime stories, cases which have a way of becoming an inescapable part of a city's iconography. Today, we wanted to take a look at some of the most iconic murders ever to take place in New York City. We will be focusing on cases that were both well-known and consequential, always to the city itself, and occasionally on a much larger scale. For this video, we will not be including cases involving terrorism, as we felt that topic deserved a video all of its own. We will also not be including famous mob murders that took place in New York, as we've already covered many of those in a previous video. We'll leave a link to that in the description for anyone interested. Be sure to let us know what you think of today's topic in the comments section below, as well as whether you'd like us to cover iconic murder cases in other cities in future videos. While you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. With that out of the way, here are 10 iconic New York City murder cases.
We decided to include this as a bonus on this week's list because although it didn't technically happen in New York City, the crime took place on a commuter train that the killer boarded in Brooklyn. As such, it is still remembered as an iconic crime that impacted the city. On the afternoon of December 7, 1993, a man named Colin Ferguson purchased a ticket for the eastbound train at the Flatbush Avenue station. He boarded the third car on the Long Island Railroad commuter train that was headed from Penn Station to Hicksville. Little did those around him know that in his bag he was carrying a Ruger P89 handgun and 160 rounds of ammunition. As the train approached a stop in Garden City, Ferguson drew his weapon and began to indiscriminately fire at those around him. In just 3 minutes, he had killed 6 people and injured 19 others. While Ferguson was reloading his third magazine, he was tackled by several other passengers on board who pinned him to the ground until he could be arrested. Ferguson's motives for the attack appeared to be contradictory and numerous. Police discovered a page in one of his notebooks that blamed the attacks on everything from racial prejudice against him to the state's Workers' Compensation Board to Governor Mario Cuomo and even some civil rights leaders. Ferguson's trial proved to be equally strange. His lawyers attempted to pioneer a temporary insanity defense based on racial prejudice that they referred to as the Black Rage defense, but Ferguson refused to cooperate. He ultimately fired his lawyers and convinced the judge that he was competent to stand trial. He then chose to represent himself in court, where he attempted to argue that he was not involved in the shooting at all. This resulted in the bizarre spectacle of Ferguson cross-examining the police who had arrested him and the victims who he had shot. The trial likely would have received much more attention nationally if it were not overshadowed by the O.J. Simpson case. Ferguson was ultimately convicted on 6 counts of murder, as well as the attempted murder of the 19 others he wounded on the train. He received a sentence of more than 315 years in prison.
In the fall of 1967, almost a full 2 years before the Manson family murders, a brutal double homicide in New York's East Village would become one of the first widely publicized cases to shed light on the darker side of the city's burgeoning hippie culture. On the night of October 8th, a janitor returning home to his basement room in a hippie flophouse was disturbed to find the dead bodies of a young man and woman there. They were completely naked, their heads bashed in with a brick. The man was 21-year-old James Hutchinson, a wanderer from Rhode Island who had become known to the local hippie community by the nickname Groovy. The young woman was 18-year-old Linda Fitzpatrick, the daughter of a wealthy Connecticut family who had recently become enamored with the local counterculture scene. The story quickly gained national media attention, largely as a result of the Fitzpatrick family's social status. Linda was portrayed as a young girl seemingly torn between two worlds. One night, she would be living in her family's mansion. The next, she'd be using her father's money to buy psychedelic drugs for all of her friends at Tompkins Square. In fact, police would later report that it was on a fateful trip to purchase LSD that she and Hutchinson were murdered. The two were lured to the Avenue B house by a man named Thomas Dennis, who introduced them to another man named Donald Ramsey. After giving them the drug, Dennis and Ramsey sexually assaulted Linda before killing both her and Hutchinson. Both men were ultimately convicted of the crime and received sentences of 15 years and life in prison, respectively.
On the early morning hours of March 25, 1990, a fire broke out at the Happy Land Social Club in the West Farms neighborhood of the Bronx. The club was packed that night with young people, many of whom were members of the Honduran community celebrating Carnival. Though the fire was put out in just minutes, it would claim 87 lives, making it the most deadly fire in New York City since the Triangle Shirtwaist factory disaster of 1911. In a desperate rush to escape, most of the victims had died from asphyxiation or trampling. Several building code violations contributed to the staggering death toll, including the club's lack of any fire exits, alarms, or sprinkler systems. Happy Land had actually been ordered to close more than a year prior, but it continued to operate without a license. It didn't take long to discover that the horrific fire was no accident. A man named Julio Gonzalez was arrested the following afternoon on suspicion of starting the fire and quickly confessed. 6 weeks before the incident, Gonzalez had broken up with his girlfriend, Lydia Feliciano, who worked as a coat checker at Happy Land. The night of the arson, Gonzalez had shown up at the club and argued with Lydia, making threats as he was ejected by a bouncer. Gonzalez then walked to a local gas station, purchased some gasoline, and returned to the club where he spread the fuel at the only entrance that ignited it. Lydia was one of the few survivors of the blaze that night and immediately pointed police to her ex-boyfriend. Gonzalez was convicted of 87 counts of murder in August of 1991, receiving 25 years to life for each count. He died in prison at the age of 61 in September of 2016.
At approximately 2:30 in the morning on March 16, 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was followed home from work by a man named Winston Mosley. As Kitty made the walk from her parking spot to the front door of her apartment building, Mosley attacked her with a hunting knife, stabbing her twice in the back. Though she was able to temporarily escape to the back of the building, Kitty collapsed near a locked door in the hallway, where she was found by a searching Mosley. Mosley stabbed her several more times before sexually assaulting her and stealing her money, after which he left her to die. Police were not immediately called to the scene, and Kitty went undiscovered for some time, eventually dying in an ambulance on the way to the hospital almost 2 hours after the attack. Winston Mosley was arrested on a burglary charge just days later and confessed to the murder shortly afterwards. Though you would think that the violent rape and stabbing death of a 28-year-old woman on its own would have been enough to generate headlines at the time, it wasn't until 2 weeks later, when a startling claim about the case was made by the New York Times, that the murders really garnered significant attention. The paper reported that no less than 38 people had witnessed the brutal murder of Kitty Genovese, and none of them had called the police or attempted to come to her aid. The explosive claim would not only come to define the case itself, but would serve as a symbol for the callous and apathetic attitudes of modern city life. The crime is also credited with starting decades of psychological research into what is now known as the bystander effect, the theory that individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim in situations where other people are present. This idea would come to characterize much of the next few decades in portrayals of urban life, particularly as New York struggled with an increasing violent crime rate throughout the 1970s and 80s. However, there is a worthwhile and interesting footnote to this story. It turns out that the narrative of dozens of indifferent and unfeeling bystanders letting a woman die were never true. Later analysis would show that there were major factual inaccuracies in the New York Times reporting, something that the paper themselves would admit after more than 5 decades in 2016. Not only was there no evidence that there were ever as many as 38 witnesses to the crime, it was not clear that the few people who had actually witnessed something that night even knew what they were seeing. This was because the second and much more brutal part of the attack happened at the back of Genovese's building, largely out of the sight of any witnesses. There was also no evidence that those who did witness the crime remained inactive. Lastly, it is important to remember that the crime predated the existence of 911. So anyone trying to reach police would have had to call a local number, which may not have been immediately known to them at the time. Despite all of these facts, many still remember the Kitty Genovese case as it was originally reported, as a dark and revealing commentary about the human condition.
On April 15, 1984, a man wielding 2 handguns entered the Liberty Avenue home of a family in Brooklyn. He fired a total of 19 shots at close range once inside, killing 8 children and 2 women, one of whom was pregnant. The only survivor was a 13-month-old girl named Christina Rivera. The iconic image of the toddler being held at the scene by NYPD officer Joanne Jaffe would become synonymous with the terrible crime. It was the largest mass shooting in New York City's history at the time and was dubbed the Palm Sunday Massacre. Several weeks later, a man named Christopher Thomas was arrested for the brutal killings. Police were tipped off by Enrique Bermudez, the owner of the home where the crime took place. Enrique's 2 children, girlfriend, and his girlfriend's extended family had been amongst those killed in the shooting. Thomas had reportedly been in a feud with Enrique leading up to the massacre, and this combined with his rampant drug use had pushed him over the edge. That summer, Thomas was found guilty of manslaughter in the case, but was spared the greater conviction of murder because jurors felt that his addiction was partly responsible for his crime. He was expected to spend at least the next 50 years in prison. Though the Palm Sunday massacre lived on in the public memory over the years, fresh outrage for the murders would be reignited when Thomas was granted parole in 2018. Members of the family and the local media were incensed to find out that Thomas would be released on good behavior after serving 2/3 of his sentence. Thomas is set to fulfill his parole in 2034 at the age of 84.
These days, we tend to look back at the rising violence that plagued New York City throughout the 1970s and 80s with curiosity. From our vantage point, after almost 3 decades of watching these incidents decline in America's largest city, it can be hard to grasp the feelings of desperation and anger that existed amongst the public at the time. This is why the Brian Watkins case is so important. It happened the very year homicides peaked in New York, and came to be seen as an icon of the city's seemingly endless problems with violence and crime. On September 2nd, 1990, Watkins, a 22-year-old Mormon from Utah, was on a trip to the city with his parents, his brother, and his sister-in-law. While standing on a subway platform waiting for the train, the family was attacked by a group of teenagers. After his father was slashed with a box cutter and his mother was kicked, he attempted to intervene and was fatally stabbed in the chest. The murder prompted a torrent of media coverage. Time magazine ran a cover story called The Rotting of the Big Apple. News outlets across the country publicized the murder, and one famous headline simply implored Mayor Dave Dinkins to do something. The response was swift. Within 24 hours, charges were laid against 8 suspects in the case, all but one of whom gave videotaped confessions to police and were convicted. One of these men, Johnny Hincapie, was famously released from prison in 2015, after it was ruled that his confession was false and coerced. In the aftermath of Watkins' death, thousands of new police officers were hired and trained, the start of a major shift in law and order politics in the city that would continue under Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Views on these policies aside, it is clear that the Watkins case marked a major turning point for New York, as well as the beginning of a noticeable attempt on behalf of the city to clean up its violent image.
Between 1989 and 1993, Joel Rifkin killed as many as 17 women in New York City. He mostly targeted sex workers who he would pick up and drive to his house before beating and strangling them to death. Even more disturbing, he would often store the bodies for several days until such a time as he could dispose of them in secret. This process would often include dismemberment. Partial remains of Rifkin's first victim, Heidi Batch, were discovered in March of 1985 on the 7th hole of a golf course in New Jersey. Rifkin had left her severed head in a paint can. Over the next few weeks, more remains were found in several other locations in New York and New Jersey. The brutal murders would continue from there for more than 4 years, with police having little idea as to the identity of the killer. That finally changed in June of 1993, when by chance 2 state troopers noticed a pickup truck driving without a license plate on Long Island's Southern State Parkway. The driver refused to pull over, and a chase ensued, ending when the truck crashed into a utility pole in Mineola, New York. The driver turned out to be Joel Rifkin. If the extended car chase hadn't been enough to tip officers off that something was seriously wrong with Rifkin, the foul odor coming from the bed of his pickup truck certainly did. When police investigated the vehicle, they found the decomposing body of Tiffany Brasciani, which had been hidden under a tarp. Rifkin had been on his way to dispose of the remains. At trial, Joel Rifkin was found guilty of a total of 9 murders and was sentenced to 203 years in prison. Rifkin was the most prolific murderer in New York since the Genesee River killer Arthur Shawcross, who had operated in the state throughout the 1970s and 80s. Unlike Shawcross, however, Rifkin's murders were mostly directly associated with New York City, as many of his victims were from Brooklyn and Manhattan. As a bizarre final note, it was reported in 1994 that Rifkin got into a jailhouse fight with Colin Ferguson, the Long Island Railroad shooter. The two were reportedly using the phones when they got into an argument about whose crimes were worse.
On May 25, 1979, 6-year-old Etan Patz went missing while on his way to the bus stop in Lower Manhattan. The disappearance would become the first of several child abduction cases to receive widespread national attention in the following years, leading to the creation of the iconic publicity campaign in the mid-1980s, which displayed photos of missing children on milk cartons. On the morning of his abduction, Etan left his Soho apartment, planning to walk the 2 blocks to the school bus stop at West Broadway and Prince Street. However, he never made it onto the bus. His absence at school was noticed but not reported, so it was not until that afternoon, when he failed to return home, that the police were called. An intense search lasting weeks happened in the wake of the young boy's disappearance, but was ultimately unsuccessful. For many years, it was believed that a man named Jose Ramos, a convicted child sexual abuser, was responsible for the crime, but police were ultimately unable to bring charges against him. As decades passed, little new information was uncovered in the case. Etan was declared legally dead in 2001. In 2010, the investigation was officially reopened, eventually leading to the announcement that a new suspect, Pedro Hernandez, was responsible for Etan's death. Hernandez had been an 18-year-old convenience store worker at the time of the boy's abduction. After several trials and court proceedings, Hernandez was finally convicted of Etan's murder in February of 2017. He received a sentence of life in prison just 2 months later. Though Etan's body was never recovered, it was believed he was killed the same day he went missing, and that Hernandez disposed of his body shortly afterwards. Since 1983, National Missing Children's Day has been held on May 25th to coincide with the anniversary of Etan Patz's abduction and murder.
In 1975, 22-year-old postal worker David Berkowitz began a killing spree that terrorized the city of New York. In just over a year, Berkowitz killed 6 people and wounded several others, usually by shooting them with a .44 caliber revolver. Most of the time, he attacked the victims in groups of 2s, often firing multiple shots into their cars before they even realized what was happening. Many of those he targeted were young women with long, dark, wavy hair. However, it was the letters that Berkowitz left at crime scenes that the case is often remembered for. Aside from taunting police and warning of murders to come, the letters were also the source of Berkowitz's iconic name, the Son of Sam. Though Berkowitz was able to evade the largest police manhunt in the history of New York City at the time, it was a coincidence that ultimately resulted in his capture. On the night of his final shooting in July of 1977, his car was ticketed near the crime scene. Based on statements from a witness, police went back and investigated every car that had been ticketed in the area that night. This eventually led them to Berkowitz's yellow Ford Galaxy, which contained an abundance of incriminating evidence including a rifle, ammunition, maps of the crime scenes, and threatening letters to police. Berkowitz confessed to the crimes quickly and has remained in prison since his arrest, where he is currently serving 6 consecutive life sentences. The intense media coverage and resulting pseudo-celebrity status of Berkowitz prompted one other noteworthy event in the case. Following his arrest, the New York legislature quickly passed statutes that have come to be known as the Son of Sam laws. The laws were designed to keep criminals from profiting off of the publicity of their crimes and have since been invoked numerous times over the years.
On February 21, 1965, civil rights and black nationalist religious leader Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights. As he was preparing to address a crowd of 400 people, a commotion broke out in the room. When his bodyguards went to investigate the disturbance, a man rushed forward and shot Malcolm X in the chest with a sawed-off shotgun, while 2 other men began to fire rounds from semi-automatic handguns. He was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. An autopsy would reveal that he had sustained 21 gunshot wounds in all, 10 of which were from the original shotgun blast. Witnesses quickly identified the 3 gunmen as Talmadge Hayer, Norman 3X Butler, and Thomas 15X Johnson. All 3 men belonged to the Nation of Islam, a black religious movement that Malcolm X had spent much of his early career advocating for. During his time with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X became one of the movement's most influential leaders, but internal tensions eventually led to his departure in 1964. As his conflict with them escalated, he was repeatedly threatened by members of the group. By the time of his assassination, Malcolm X knew that the Nation of Islam was actively trying to kill him. The gunmen who were identified by witnesses at the shooting were tried and convicted of Malcolm X's murder in March of 1966 and sentenced to life in prison. Though Hayer would confess to the killing, the other 2 men maintained their innocence. The case remains an ongoing source of speculation. it's hard to capture just how influential a figure Malcolm X was on the legacy of the civil rights movement in America. Though the crime is remembered as one that had ramifications far beyond the boundaries of New York City, it is undoubtedly one of the most iconic and consequential murders ever to take place there.
Though many will no doubt be familiar with the story of John Lennon's assassination, no list of iconic New York City murders would be complete without mentioning it. On the evening of December 8, 1980, the former Beatle was shot and killed outside of his apartment in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The perpetrator was a man named Mark David Chapman. Lennon had spent several hours that night at the Record Planet studio with his wife Yoko Ono before the couple returned to their apartment at approximately 10:50 p.m. Chapman was waiting for them in the archway of the building on West 72nd Street just before the entrance. As the couple passed the archway, Chapman fired 5 shots at Lennon, 4 of which hit him in the back and shoulder. Lennon staggered into the lobby, where he fell to the floor. As the building's doorman and a concierge frantically tried to tend to Lennon's wounds, Chapman remained calmly at the crime scene. He took off a hat and jacket that he'd been wearing, threw away the gun, and began reading a paperback copy of J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. Chapman was quickly arrested when police arrived and made no attempt to resist or run away. Lennon was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. The damage he had sustained from the bullet wounds had caused him to lose more than 80% of his blood volume. It is impossible to capture the scale of the response that followed, as outpourings of grief from all over the world happened in the wake of Lennon's death. Instead of a funeral, Yoko Ono requested 10 minutes of silence to be observed on December 14th. When the day arrived, 30,000 people gathered in Lennon's hometown of Liverpool, and in Central Park the crowd numbered more than 225,000. Chapman would later give no shortage of bizarre reasons for the murder, including being enraged by Lennon's remark that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, as well as the feeling that the musician's later work revealed that he was a phony. He also said The Catcher in the Rye had taken on a great personal significance for him, and that he wanted to model his life off of the novel's protagonist, Holden Caulfield. According to later comments from Chapman, he had written the words, "This is my statement," in a copy of the book he was reading when he was arrested. While memorials and tributes to John Lennon are too numerous to list, one of the most noteworthy of these was built in the area of Central Park directly across from Lennon's apartment building. Known as Strawberry Fields, it was unveiled by the city in 1985 and received donations from countries all over the world.
That brings us to the end of our list. Let us know in the comments section below which city you'd like us to focus on for our next video about iconic murder cases. As always, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos. Thank you for watching.